17-year-old Clara Bowen was thrown into the freezing rain with nothing but a trash bag of clothes and $32 to her name. Her stepfather locked the door, leaving her to the unforgiving streets. Desperate and shivering, she broke into the notorious, abandoned Montgomery house at the edge of town, just looking for a place to survive the winter night. She thought she was stepping into a decaying relic of the past, a dusty tomb forgotten by the world. What she didn't know was that these rotting walls were guarding a secret, a multi-million-dollar fortune that was about to change her life forever and paint a deadly target on her back. The deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot. Clara Bowen stood on the front porch of the only home she had ever known, the icy November rain plastering her dark hair to her cheeks. In her hands, she clutched a heavy-duty black trash bag containing a few pairs of jeans, some oversized sweaters, and a faded photograph of her mother. That was it. 17 years of existence reduced to 30 pounds of garbage. On the other side of the frosted glass door stood Mitchell Ross. Mitchell had married Clara's mother, Evelyn, 5 years ago. He had always been a cold, distant man. But when Evelyn was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, his coldness morphed into outright resentment. The medical bills drained their savings. The stress fractured whatever fragile peace existed in the house. And then, 3 weeks ago, Evelyn passed away. Mitchell didn't even wait for the earth to settle over Evelyn's grave before putting the house in Everett, Pennsylvania, on the market. Tonight, after a minor argument over a misplaced utility bill, he snapped. He told Clara she wasn't his blood, she wasn't his responsibility, and she was no longer his problem. "Don't come back, Clara," his muffled voice had growled through the door just moments before. "The house is sold. I'm leaving for Florida on Tuesday. Figure your own life out." Clara stood frozen, waiting for the door to open, waiting for it to be a cruel joke. But the porch light flicked off, plunging her into darkness. The reality of the situation crashed into her like a physical blow. She was 17, legally still a minor, but with no immediate family left, no father in the picture, and a child services system in the county that was notoriously broken. If she went to the police, she'd be thrown into a group home, or worse, Mitchell would spin a lie about her being a runaway. She hoisted the trash bag over her shoulder, the plastic stretching dangerously, and stepped off the porch. The town of Everett was a quintessential Rust Belt casualty. Shuttered factories lined the river, and storefronts on Main Street sat vacant, their windows plastered with fading for lease signs. At 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, the streets were entirely deserted. The rain was turning to sleet, biting at Clara's exposed hands and face. She wore a thin denim jacket over a flannel shirt, woefully inadequate for the plunging temperatures. She walked for 2 hours. She passed Sandy's diner, the neon sign buzzing angrily in the night. She checked her pockets, $32.14. A hot cup of coffee and a booth would cost her $3, but she couldn't stay there all night. Sandy, the owner, was kind, but she ran a business, not a shelter. Clara kept walking, her sneakers soaking through, her toes going numb. Hypothermia wasn't just a distant medical term. It was a rapidly approaching reality. Her teeth chattered violently. She needed shelter, and she needed it now. She found herself walking up the steep incline of Maple Ridge Road, the wealthy, older section of town where the lumber and steel barons used to live a century ago. At the very top of the hill, secluded behind a dense wall of overgrown, dead ivy and rusted wrought iron gates, sat the Montgomery estate. Every kid in Everett knew about the Montgomery place. It was a massive, Victorian-style mansion with peeling gray paint, shattered turret windows, and a sagging wraparound porch. It had belonged to Beatrice Montgomery, a wealthy, reclusive widow who had died under mysterious circumstances a decade ago. Since then, the property had been locked in a bitter, endless probate battle between her estranged nephews and nieces. Nobody lived there. Nobody cared for it. It was a ghost ship anchored on a hill. Clara approached the rusted gates. A heavy padlock secured the chain, but the iron bars were wide enough for a slender teenager to squeeze through. Ignoring the scrape of rusted metal against her ribs, she pushed herself and her trash bag through the gap. The yard was a jungle of dead briars and knee-high weeds. The looming silhouette of the mansion looked terrifying in the dark, its broken windows resembling hollow, staring eyes. But to Clara, it didn't look like a haunted house. It looked like survival. She crept around the side of the house, avoiding the front porch where the rotting wood might collapse under her weight. Near the back, half buried under a massive, dead oak tree, she found a cellar bulkhead. The wooden doors were bloated with rot. Pulling hard on the rusted handle, she managed to pry one side up just enough to reveal a sliver of total blackness. Taking a deep breath, Clara shoved her bag down the hole, turned around, and slid feet first into the dark. She landed hard on a concrete floor, surrounded by the smell of mildew, damp earth, and ancient dust. She pulled out her cracked smartphone. The battery was at 22%. She switched on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the basement. It was massive, filled with old coal chutes, discarded rusted tools, and stacked cardboard boxes that had long since melted into pulpy mounds from water damage. It was freezing down here, but at least she was out of the wind and the sleet. Clara found a wooden staircase leading up. The stairs groaned in protest under her weight, echoing loudly in the cavernous silence of the house. She reached the top, finding a heavy oak door. She turned the brass knob. It clicked, and the door swung open, revealing the grand kitchen of the Montgomery estate. Even in decay, it was magnificent. Checkerboard marble floors, a massive cast-iron stove, and towering glass front cabinets. But it was wide open, drafty, and far too exposed. If anyone looked through the windows, they would see her flashlight. She navigated through the kitchen, entering a long, narrow hallway. "Think, Clara," she muttered to herself, her breath pluming in the cold air. Where did the servants sleep? In these old Victorian homes, the servants usually had smaller, insulated rooms in the back or the attic. She found a narrow, secondary staircase tucked behind a pantry. She climbed it, emerging into a small, windowless room that likely used to belong to a maid. There was a rusted iron bed frame with a mattress so old it looked like a block of concrete, a small wooden dresser, and a thick woolen rug that had somehow survived the dampness. Because it had no windows, it was pitch black, meaning she could use her phone light without fear of being spotted from the street. More importantly, it was noticeably warmer than the rest of the house. Clara dragged the old rug into the corner, fashioning a makeshift nest. She opened her trash bag, putting on every single layer of clothing she owned, 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, and both her sweaters. She curled into a tight ball on the rug, shivering violently as the adrenaline finally left her system. She was homeless. She was entirely alone. But as the sound of the sleet battered the slate roof high above her, Clara closed her eyes. She was alive. And for tonight, that had to be enough. Clara woke up to a sliver of pale grey light creeping under the heavy oak door of her small room. Every muscle in her body ached, a deep, bone-weary stiffness that came from sleeping on a hard floor in freezing temperatures. She sat up, her breath visible in the frigid air. The reality of her situation hit her all over again, a heavy weight pressing on her chest. Mitchell was gone. Her mother was gone. This dusty, forgotten room was all she had. Her phone was dead. She had turned it off to save the last 5% of battery, but the cold had drained it anyway. Clara stood up, stretching her stiff limbs, and pushed the door open. In the daylight, the Montgomery estate was a tragic masterpiece. Clara walked softly down the grand staircase, her sneakers making no sound on the thick layer of dust blanketing the hardwood stairs. Sunlight filtered through the grimy, leaded glass windows, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the air. The main foyer was breathtaking, a massive crystal chandelier, dark with grime and cobwebs, hung from the vaulted ceiling. The furniture in the parlor, heavy velvet sofas, mahogany end tables, and a grand piano, were covered in yellowing linen sheets, making them look like a gathering of ghosts. Clara realized she needed a plan. She couldn't just sit here and freeze to death. She needed food, water, and a way to stay warm. The house's plumbing was long dead. She had tried a faucet in the kitchen earlier and gotten nothing but a hollow groan. She sneaked out through the basement just as she had come in, carefully pulling the bulkhead door shut. She walked a mile down to a gas station on the edge of the highway, using the public restroom to wash her face, drink as much water from the sink as she could stomach, and fill an empty plastic bottle she found in the trash. She spent $4 on a loaf of cheap white bread and a jar of generic peanut butter. When she returned to the mansion, she felt a strange sense of ownership. It was a bizarre coping mechanism, but framing this massive, terrifying house as her sanctuary helped keep the panic at bay. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara fell into a survival routine. She spent her days at the Everett Public Library, reading books to pass the time and soaking up the free heating. The librarians looked at her with pitying eyes, noticing her repeating outfits and unwashed hair, but they never asked questions. At dusk, she would slip back up the hill, squeeze through the rusted gates, and return to her maid's room. She started cleaning her small section of the house. Using an old rag she found in the laundry room, she dusted the floors and wiped down the small dresser. She found a heavy velvet curtain in one of the guest bedrooms and dragged it to her room, using it as a remarkably warm blanket. But her fragile peace was shattered on a cold Tuesday morning. Clara was in the massive main library of the house, a spectacular room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, sliding a rolling ladder along a track just to see if it still worked. Suddenly, she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside. She froze. Heavy footsteps pounded on the front porch. A key grated loudly in the front door's deadbolt. Clara scrambled off the ladder, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sprinted silently toward the servants' stairs just as the heavy oak front door groaned open. "Place is a disaster." A loud, booming voice echoed through the foyer. Clara pressed herself against the wall at the top of the servants' stairs, holding her breath. "I don't care what the inspector says," the voice continued. "The Montgomery family finally settled the probate last week. The nephews are selling the lot to a developer. They want this monstrosity demolished by March." Clara peered carefully through the wooden balustrades. Standing in the foyer were 2 men. One was wearing a yellow hard hat and a high-vis jacket. The other was a man Clara recognized from town, Victor Collins. Victor was a local real estate agent, known for being ruthless, cutting corners, and foreclosing on struggling families with zero remorse. He was wearing a sharp, expensive overcoat and looking around the grand foyer with utter disgust. "Demolition?" the contractor asked, looking up at the chandelier. "It's a shame. Good bones in this place. Solid oak, hand-carved trim. It's a money pit," Victor sneered, kicking a sheet-covered chair. Beatrice Montgomery was a lunatic, holed up in here for 20 years, screaming at the mailman, claiming her family was trying to poison her. She let the place rot. The land is worth 10 times what the house is. Go check the foundation in the basement. I want to make sure the backhoes won't hit any hidden oil tanks. Clara's blood ran cold. If they tore the house down, she would be back on the street in the dead of winter. Worse, if the contractor went to the basement, he might notice the scuff marks near the bulkhead where Clara came in and out. He might notice her trash bag hidden in her upstairs room. She silently crept back to her maid's room, grabbed her trash bag, and shoved it deep into the back of the small closet, pulling an old, broken chair in front of it. She climbed inside the closet herself, pulling the door shut until it was just a crack, and waited in the suffocating darkness. She heard them walk through the first floor. She heard their heavy boots on the stairs. "Look at this junk." Victor's voice came from the master bedroom down the hall. "The nephews told me to keep an eye out for anything valuable. Jewelry, cash." The old bat was paranoid. Didn't trust banks. "Find anything?" the contractor asked. "Nothing but mothballs and rat droppings," Victor scoffed. "She probably squandered it all. Let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." Clara stayed in the closet for a full hour after she heard their truck pull away. When she finally emerged, her hands were shaking. Her sanctuary had an expiration date, March. She had until the ground thawed, and then the bulldozers were coming. And Victor Collins was sniffing around for valuables. She walked back down to the Grand Library, looking at the thousands of dusty books. Beatrice Montgomery, a paranoid recluse who didn't trust banks. If Victor thought there might be money hidden here, maybe there was. Clara needed money. Even a few $100s could get her a bus ticket to a warmer state. Maybe rent a cheap motel room while she found a diner job. She looked at the vast, silent house differently now. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a hunting ground. The temperature plummeted further as December arrived. The wind howled through the loose shingles of the Montgomery estate, sounding like mourning voices. Clara was constantly cold, her fingers stiff, her lips perpetually chapped. Her diet of peanut butter sandwiches and canned beans, bought with the last of her meager funds, was leaving her weak and lethargic. Since Victor Collins's visit, Clara had spent every daylight hour tearing the house apart. It became an obsession, a way to keep her mind off the gnawing hunger in her stomach and the biting cold. She methodically searched the guest bedrooms, checking under mattresses, knocking on walls for hollow sounds, and prying open stuck dresser drawers. She found nothing but old clothes, terrifying porcelain dolls that seemed to watch her move, and moth-eaten blankets. By the third week of December, desperation was setting in. She had exactly $1.40 left. She was sitting in the Grand Library one afternoon. It was her favorite room. Despite the dust, it felt warm, insulated by the thousands of leather-bound books. She sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in her heavy velvet curtain, staring blankly at the wall. The library walls were covered in an ornate, dark green floral wallpaper that was heavily water-damaged near the baseboards. As Clara stared at it, her eyes tracking the swirling, fading vines, she noticed something odd. The pattern didn't line up perfectly near the massive, carved mahogany fireplace. Clara frowned. In a house built with such obsessive attention to detail, a misaligned wallpaper seam was a glaring error. She stood up, dropping the velvet curtain, and walked over to the fireplace. She knelt. The wallpaper right at knee height, beside the stone hearth, was slightly bubbling. She reached out and pressed her thumb against the bubble. It didn't feel solid like the plaster behind the rest of the wall. It yielded slightly, like thin wood. Her heart did a strange, erratic flutter. She pulled her pocket knife out of her jeans, a small, dull Swiss Army knife Mitchell had left on the kitchen counter years ago. She carefully inserted the blade into the seam of the wallpaper and pulled downward. The brittle, decades-old paper tore easily. As it peeled away, a cloud of fine dust puffed into the air. Clara coughed, waving the dust away. Beneath the wallpaper wasn't plaster. It was a square wooden panel, about a foot wide, set flush into the wall. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible notch at the bottom. Clara wedged the knife blade into the notch and pried. The wood groaned, protesting after years of immobility. She twisted the knife harder, the cheap metal handle digging into her palm. With a sharp crack, the panel popped out, falling onto the dusty floor. Clara gasped. Inside the wall was a dark, square cavity. She grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight feature, and shined it inside. Sitting in the dust was a heavy, rectangular box made of dark, oxidized iron. It had a brass handle on the top and a small, intricate keyhole on the front. Clara's hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the handle. She hauled the box out. It was surprisingly heavy, maybe 10 pounds. She set it on the floor, coughing, as more dust swirled around her. It was locked. "Damn it," she whispered, her voice sounding raspy and loud in the silent house. She examined the lock. It was old, but sturdy. She wasn't picking this with a Swiss Army knife. She needed a tool. She ran down to the basement, grabbing a rusted crowbar she had seen near the coal chute. She sprinted back up the stairs, ignoring the burning in her lungs, driven purely by adrenaline. She wedged the curved end of the crowbar under the lip of the iron box and leaned her entire body weight onto it. The metal squealed, a horrific, high-pitched sound. Clara pushed harder, gritting her teeth. Snap! The brass lock gave way, shattering into pieces. Clara threw the crowbar aside and flipped the heavy lid open. There was no cash, no gold bars, no jewelry. Clara let out a ragged sigh, collapsing back onto her heels, fighting the sudden urge to cry. It was just paper. She reached into the box. Inside was a thick stack of letters, bundled together with a rotting piece of twine, a black and white photograph, and a heavy brass key with a strange, jagged bow. She picked up the photograph first. It showed a young, strikingly beautiful woman in a 1950s-style dress standing in front of the Montgomery estate. She was smiling, holding the hand of a little girl. On the back, written in elegant, looping cursive, were the words Beatrice and Amelia. The last happy summer, 1958. Clara set the photo down and picked up the letters. The twine disintegrated in her hands. She opened the top letter. The paper was thick, expensive, and yellowed with age. The date at the top read, the 14th of October, 1982. She began to read, "My dearest Amelia, if you are reading this, then my heart finally gave out, or they finally succeeded in silencing me. I know you think I am mad. I know you left this house because you could not bear the paranoia that consumed me. But you must believe me, Amelia. My fears were not born of madness, but of survival. Your cousins, Thomas, Eleanor, and that vile creature, Victor's father, they have been circling like vultures for a decade. They think I am a foolish old widow sitting on the Montgomery empire. They think they can simply outlive me and claim the timber rights, the offshore accounts, and the estate." Clara paused, her breath catching in her throat. Victor's father? Victor Collins, the property manager who wanted the house demolished, was connected to Beatrice's family? She continued reading. "They have tried to have me committed. They have poisoned my tea. They have corrupted the local judges, but I outsmarted them all. I liquidated everything, the stocks, the bonds, the jewels. I turned the Montgomery legacy into something untraceable, and I buried it where none of those greedy sycophants will ever find it. I am leaving you this breadcrumb, Amelia. I hid the first key where only someone desperate for warmth would find it beside the hearth of the Grand Library. You must follow the trail. The fortune is yours, my daughter. Do not let them take it. The next piece of the puzzle is hidden where the weeping angel watches the sun rise. Trust no one. Mother." Clara stared at the letter, her mind spinning. Millions of dollars, liquidated and hidden somewhere on this property or in this town. And Victor Collins wasn't just a hired property manager, he was part of the bloodline, part of the family trying to steal it all. If he found out what was in this house, he wouldn't just evict Clara, he would destroy her. She looked down at the heavy brass key in her palm. It felt cold and electric against her skin. She wasn't just a homeless teenager anymore. She was a player in a dangerous, decades-old game. And if she could solve Beatrice Montgomery's puzzle before the bulldozers arrived in March, she would never have to be cold, hungry, or helpless ever again. Clara looked out the dusty library window, where the weeping angel watches the sun rise. She whispered to the empty room. She knew exactly where that was. The town of Everett had only one cemetery old enough to house the town's founding families. Easton Cemetery sat on a sprawling, rolling hill on the eastern edge of the city limits, bordered by a dense line of skeletal winter trees. Clara knew it well. Her mother had been buried there just weeks ago, in the newer, flat marker section near the highway. But Clara wasn't visiting her mother today. It was 6 a.m. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the temperature hovered at a brutal 19 degrees. Clara had wrapped her feet in plastic grocery bags before putting on her sneakers, a desperate trick she'd read about to keep the snow from soaking through. She trudged through the knee-deep drifts, her breath freezing on the collar of her jacket. At the highest point of the cemetery, overlooking the frozen river, stood the Montgomery family plot. It was enclosed by a rusted iron fence. In the center, dominating the space, was a life-sized marble statue of a weeping angel. The angel was slumped over a massive stone pedestal, its stone wings draped in sorrow, its face buried in its arms. "Where the weeping angel watches the sun rise," Clara whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. She walked around to the front of the statue. The angel was facing due east. As Clara stood there, the first sliver of morning sun breached the horizon, casting a pale, weak light across the snow. The light hit the base of the statue, illuminating a stone plaque etched with the names of Beatrice's ancestors. Clara knelt in the snow, brushing away a layer of frost from the base. She felt along the stone, her numb fingers searching for a seam, a crack, anything. She checked the angel's pedestal. Nothing. She checked the iron fence. Nothing. Panic began to set in. Her toes were completely numb. If she didn't find it soon, she would have to turn back or risk losing a toe to frostbite. Frustrated, she looked up at the angel. The morning sun was hitting the statue's back, casting a long shadow over the pedestal. But the light was also reflecting off something tucked beneath the angel's draped arms. Clara climbed onto the stone base, balancing precariously. She reached into the hollow space between the angel's arms and its chest. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. It was a heavy bronze urn, cemented into the statue itself. But at the base of the urn, hidden entirely from view, unless you knew exactly where to reach, was a small, circular keyhole. She pulled the jagged brass key from her pocket. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped it twice into the snow, sobbing in frustration as she dug it out. Finally, she guided the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. She turned it. A sharp click echoed in the quiet cemetery. The bottom of the bronze urn swung open on a concealed hinge. Clara caught a heavy, waterproof leather pouch before it fell into the snow. She scrambled off the pedestal, shoving the pouch into her jacket. But before she could open it, the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel path made her freeze. She threw herself behind a large granite mausoleum adjacent to the Montgomery plot, burying her face in her knees to make herself as small as possible. Footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate. Then, a voice broke the silence. "I don't care what the zoning board said, David. You pay them off." It was Victor Collins. Clara held her breath, her chest burning. Through the gap between the mausoleum and the snowbank, she could see Victor's expensive leather boots. He was standing directly in front of the weeping angel. "No, we are not waiting until March," Victor barked into his cell phone. "I want the permits expedited." My useless aunt was a paranoid hoarder, and the longer that house sits there, the more likely some squatter is going to burn it down. Or worse, Amelia comes out of hiding to contest the will. There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. Victor kicked at the snow angrily. "Listen to me," Victor snarled. "I have buyers lined up for the subdivision. I need that lot cleared. Move the demolition date up. I want the bulldozers on Maple Ridge Road by January 15th. Do whatever it takes." January 15th. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. It was December 22nd. Her timeline hadn't just shrunk, it had evaporated. She had less than a month before the Montgomery estate, and whatever fortune was hidden inside it was reduced to rubble. Victor hung up the phone. Clara heard him muttering curses under his breath before he turned and crunched back down the path toward his parked SUV. Clara stayed hidden for 20 minutes until she was sure he was gone. When she finally stood up, her joints screamed in protest. She didn't open the leather pouch until she had sneaked back into her hidden maid's room, locking the heavy oak door behind her. Sitting on her velvet blanket, shivering violently, she untied the leather cords of the pouch. Inside was a heavy iron gear, about the size of her palm, with strange symbols etched into the metal. Beneath the gear was another piece of thick, yellowed paper. "Amelia, if you hold this gear, you have braved the cold and avoided their gaze. But time is always the enemy. Victor's father was a thief, and the son is no better. They search the walls and the floors, but they are too brutish to understand the art of misdirection. The fortune is not a pile of gold waiting to be stumbled upon. It is locked behind iron and time. The next piece of the mechanism is waiting where the music died, but the melody remains frozen in ivory and wood. Find the hollow heart." "Mother," Clara stared at the heavy iron gear. A mechanism. Beatrice hadn't just hidden money. She had built a puzzle, a mechanical safe, spread across the estate, where the music died, but the melody remains frozen in ivory and wood. She looked toward the door of her room, the grand piano in the parlor. The parlor was the coldest room in the house. The massive bay windows were drafty, letting the bitter winter wind whistle through the gaps in the framing. Clara stood in the center of the room, staring at the grand piano hidden beneath a yellowing linen sheet. She grabbed the edge of the sheet and pulled. A cloud of dust billowed into the air, revealing a magnificent Steinway grand piano. The black lacquer was dull, and the brass pedals were tarnished green, but it was still a beautiful, imposing instrument. Frozen in ivory and wood, Clara ran her hand over the keys. Most of the ivory was chipped or missing. She pressed middle C. The key depressed with a stiff, wooden thud, but no sound came out. The strings were dead. She spent an hour examining the exterior of the piano. She checked beneath the bench, finding nothing but old sheet music. She felt along the heavy wooden legs. Nothing. Find the hollow heart? She muttered to herself. She lifted the heavy lid of the piano, propping it open with the wooden stick. The interior was a complex web of steel strings and wooden hammers. To Clara, it looked like a foreign landscape. Where was the heart? She leaned in, shining her phone's flashlight across the soundboard, the large, flat piece of wood beneath the strings that amplifies the sound. Near the back, tucked beneath the thickest bass strings, was a circular wooden plug, almost perfectly flush with the soundboard. Clara reached in, careful not to cut herself on the rusted steel strings. She pressed on the plug. It didn't budge. She pressed harder. Nothing. Then she remembered the iron gear from the cemetery. She pulled it from her pocket. The gear had a square hole in the center. She looked closer at the wooden plug in the piano. In the very middle of it, filled with the decades of dust, was a square peg. Clara carefully maneuvered the heavy iron gear over the strings and slid it onto the square peg. It fit perfectly. She grabbed the edges of the gear and turned it clockwise. It was incredibly stiff. She used both hands, straining her wrists. With a loud, grinding crack, the gear turned a quarter inch. She kept pushing. Suddenly, a mechanism deep inside the piano snapped. The entire wooden panel at the front of the piano, the music desk where sheet music rests, popped forward. Clara gasped, quickly catching the heavy piece of wood before it crashed onto the keys. Behind the music desk was a hidden compartment, lined in dark velvet. Inside was a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth, and another brass key. Clara grabbed the bundle, her hands trembling. She unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside were 3 bearer bonds. Clara had read about them in a library book once. They were like cash. Whoever physically possessed the paper owned the money. Each bond was stamped with a staggering sum, $100,000, $300,000, right here in her hands. But beneath the bonds was a leather-bound journal. Clara opened it. The first page was a master ledger. Bearer bonds, 300,000 piano. Swiss account routing, Geneva, $4.2 million. Deed to the timber reserves, escrow, valued at $1.8 million. Clara's breath hitched. $6 million. Beatrice Montgomery had successfully hidden $6 million, and the account numbers and routing information were likely locked behind the final puzzle. She flipped to the next page of the journal. Amelia, the final vault is beneath the earth, where the iron lungs of the house breathe coal and fire. But beware, the final lock requires the 3 keys, and it will not open quietly. Once the mechanism is engaged, the house will know. Make sure you are alone. Clara frowned. The iron lungs of the house breathe coal and fire, the massive, rusted furnace in the basement. Suddenly, a blinding light swept across the parlor windows, illuminating the dust in the air. Clara dropped to the floor, her heart stopping. A heavy truck had just pulled into the driveway. Doors slammed. "I don't care if it's almost Christmas, Brody," Victor Collins's voice carried through the freezing night air. "The demo crew starts in 3 weeks. We tear this place down to the studs tonight. If the old bat hid anything in the walls, I want it before the bulldozers get here. I got the sledgehammers in the back." A rough, unfamiliar voice replied. Footsteps pounded on the porch. A key slammed into the front door. Clara was trapped. The parlor opened directly into the main foyer. If she ran for the stairs, they would see her. If she stayed here, they would find her within minutes. She scrambled backward, clutching the journal, the bonds, and the 2 keys to her chest. She looked frantically around the parlor. There was a massive fireplace on the far wall. Next to it was an ornate wooden paneling that stretched floor to ceiling. She remembered a book she had read at the library about Victorian architecture. Servants often had hidden access doors to restock fires without disturbing the wealthy owners. She crawled toward the fireplace, pressing her hands against the wood paneling. "Please," she whispered. "Please." The front door groaned open. "Start in the parlor," Victor ordered. "Smash the plaster behind the bookshelves." Clara pressed desperately on the wood molding near the floor. It clicked. A narrow, 2-foot-wide section of the paneling popped inward. It was a dumbwaiter shaft, barely large enough for firewood. She squeezed her body into the pitch-black shaft, just as heavy boots stepped into the parlor. She pulled the wooden panel shut behind her, plunging herself into total darkness. "Look at this," Brody's rough voice echoed through the thin wood. "Someone pulled the sheet off the piano, and the front is torn open." Silence hung in the room. Clara held her breath, pressing her hands over her mouth. "Someone is in the house," Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "Lock the front door, Brody. Nobody leaves." The dumbwaiter shaft was a coffin of splintering oak and suffocating darkness. Clara pressed her spine against the back wall, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, clutching the journal, the bearer bonds, and the 2 brass keys. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the rising panic that threatened to crush her lungs. A few feet away, on the other side of the thin wood paneling, Brody's sledgehammer slammed into the parlor wall. The impact sent a violent tremor through the shaft. Plaster dust rained down on Clara's head, coating her hair and stinging her eyes. "Tear the mantel out," Victor barked, his voice muffled but terrifyingly close. "She's in here somewhere. Check the closets. Check the floorboards." Clara knew she had minutes, maybe seconds, before Brody's hammer crashed through the paneling that concealed her. She reached into the pitch-black void beside her and felt the thick, braided hemp rope of the dumbwaiter pulley system. It felt dry and brittle, coated in a century of grime, but it was her only way out. She swung her legs over the edge of the narrow ledge, gripping the rope with both hands. It was a straight drop down to the basement, where the kitchen staff would have originally loaded firewood to haul up to the parlor. She took a deep breath, wrapped her legs around the rope, and slid. The rough hemp burned through her denim jacket, friction searing the palms of her hands. Halfway down, the rotting rope let out a sickening snap. Clara dropped the last 10 feet in free fall. She slammed into the top of the wooden dumbwaiter box, resting at the bottom of the shaft, the wood splintering beneath her boots. She bit her tongue hard to keep from screaming, the metallic taste of blood instantly filling her mouth. Above her, the smashing continued, a relentless percussion of destruction. Clara scrambled out of the shaft, tumbling onto the freezing concrete floor of the basement. She was bruised, and her hands were bleeding, but she was alive. She pulled out her phone. The battery icon was flashing red, 4%. She turned on the flashlight, casting a weak, trembling beam across the cavernous room. The final vault is beneath the earth, where the iron lungs of the house breathe coal and fire. She swept the light toward the center of the basement. Rising from the concrete like a dormant mechanical beast was the original coal furnace. It was a massive structure of rusted cast iron, easily 8 feet tall, with thick ducts extending outward like the tentacles of an octopus. Clara ran to it, her sneakers slipping on the damp floor. She examined the front of the furnace. It had 3 heavy iron doors, the top loading door for coal, the middle firebox, and the bottom ash cleanout. Right in the center of the middle door, obscured by decades of rust and soot, was a heavy brass plate. Clara wiped the grime away with her sleeve. Set into the brass were 3 distinct keyholes. Clara's heart sank. She looked at the 2 keys in her hand, the jagged brass key from the library wall, and the second key hidden inside the piano. Where was the third? She frantically flipped through Beatrice's journal, illuminating the pages with her dying phone light. There was no mention of another location. The final lock requires the 3 keys. "Think," Clara whispered frantically, her breath pluming in the cold. Beatrice had hidden the keys, where the elements of the house aligned with her riddles, where the weeping angel watches, where the music died, where the iron lungs breathe coal and fire. Clara dropped to her knees. The bottom door of the furnace, the ash pit. She grabbed the rusted latch of the bottom door and yanked. It squealed open, releasing a cloud of acrid, black coal dust. Clara coughed violently, waving the dust away. She aimed her phone light inside. It was a deep cavity filled with a thick layer of heavy, black soot. Disgusting as it was, she had no choice. She plunged her bare, bleeding hands into the freezing ash. She dug frantically, sifting through sharp chunks of unburned coal and rusted nails. Her fingers brushed against something cold and unnaturally smooth. She grabbed it and pulled it out into the light. It was a heavy, black iron key, its handle shaped like a stylized flame. The third key. Got it, she breathed, wiping the soot on her jeans. She stood up and approached the brass plate on the middle door. She inserted the library key into the first slot. It slid in smoothly. She inserted the piano key into the second slot. It clicked into place. Finally, she slid the heavy iron key from the ash pit into the center slot. She grabbed all three keys. The journal warned her, once the mechanism is engaged, the house will know. There was no turning back. Clara twisted the three keys simultaneously. Deep inside the belly of the furnace, a massive, heavy tumbler slammed into place. It sounded like a gunshot. Then, a series of hidden industrial gears began to turn. The sound was deafening, a horrific, grinding screech of metal on metal that echoed through the concrete basement and vibrated up the wooden support beams of the house. The heavy cast-iron door of the firebox slowly swung outward with a loud groan, revealing a pristine, stainless steel vault door hidden within the belly of the furnace. Upstairs, the sledgehammers stopped instantly. What the hell was that? Brody's voice yelled, muffled by the floorboards. The basement, Victor roared. Get to the basement. Clara grabbed the handle of the stainless steel vault and pulled. It was heavy, perfectly balanced on ball bearings. Inside the vault was a large, waterproof pelican case. She hauled the heavy black case out, dropping it onto the concrete floor. She unlatched the heavy plastic clasps and flipped the lid open. Inside, sitting on a bed of custom-cut foam, was a stack of legal documents stamped with the seal of a prominent Zurich bank, a thick stack of $100 bills bound in bank tape, and a notarized, wax-sealed envelope addressed to the victorious bearer. She had found it, the $6 million. Heavy boots thundered down the wooden basement stairs. Hey, a voice bellowed. Clara spun around, shoving the bearer bonds and the journal into the pelican case, snapping it shut. Victor Collins stood at the bottom of the stairs, a heavy maglite in his hand. Brody stood behind him, his massive shoulders heaving, gripping a long-handled sledgehammer. Victor shined the bright beam of the flashlight directly into Clara's face, blinding her. Well, Victor sneered, his voice echoing in the cold basement. Look what the rats dragged in. Mitchell Ross's little stray. Clara held up a hand to block the glaring light, her other arm wrapping fiercely around the handle of the heavy pelican case. Put it down, kid, Victor said, taking a slow step forward. His eyes were fixed on the open furnace and the black case in her arms. Greed twisted his sharp features into an ugly, hungry smile. That belongs to my family. It belongs to whoever Beatrice wanted to have it. Clara fired back, her voice shaking but her grip unyielding. And she spent her entire life making sure it wasn't you. Victor's smile vanished. Brody, grab the case. Throw her out in the snow. Brody stepped forward, the sledgehammer dragging with a metallic scrape against the concrete. He was twice Clara's size, moving with a slow, deliberate menace. Clara backed up, her boots crunching on the loose coals scattered across the floor. She was cornered between the massive furnace and the brick foundation wall. But she knew this basement. She had lived in this house for a month. She knew every shadow, every rusted tool, and every exit. She looked to her left. Leaning against the foundation wall, directly beneath the heavy wooden coal chute she used to sneak in, was a massive, unstable shelving unit. It was loaded with ancient, lead-based paint cans and rusted iron pipe fittings. As Brody lunged forward, reaching out a meaty hand to grab her jacket, Clara dropped to the floor. She kicked out with both feet, planting her heavy sneakers squarely against the rusted, weakened support leg of the shelving unit. The metal crumpled. The entire unit pitched forward with a catastrophic crash. Dozens of heavy paint cans and iron pipes rained down directly onto Brody. He roared in pain as a heavy pipe struck his shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor in a tangle of metal and spilled, dried paint chips. "You little brat," Victor screamed. He dropped the flashlight and lunged at her. Clara scrambled to her feet, clutching the case. She reached into the open ash pit of the furnace and hurled a massive handful of blinding black soot directly into Victor's face. He shrieked, clawing at his eyes, stumbling backward into the still spinning wheel of the overturned shelving unit. Clara didn't wait to see him fall. She leaped onto the broken shelves, using them as a stepping stone, and scrambled up into the sloping wooden tunnel of the coal chute. She hit the rotting wooden bulkhead doors at the top with her shoulders. They burst open, shattering into the freezing, sleet-filled night. Clara scrambled out onto the snow-covered lawn of the estate. The bitter wind hit her like a physical blow, but the adrenaline pumping through her veins made her entirely numb to the cold. She clutched the heavy case to her chest and ran. She ran through the overgrown briars, squeezed through the gap in the rusted iron gates, and sprinted down Maple Ridge Road, not stopping until the dark, looming silhouette of the Montgomery estate disappeared into the storm. 4 months later, the mahogany desk in the high-rise Philadelphia law office gleamed under the warm track lighting. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the spring sun shone brightly over the city skyline. Clara sat in a plush leather chair, wearing a tailored navy blue blazer. She sipped a hot, expensive latte, her hands perfectly steady. Across the desk sat David Smith, one of the most ruthless and expensive estate attorneys on the East Coast. He had been easily retained when Clara had walked into his office 3 months prior, placed a single $100,000 bearer bond on his desk, and told him her story. "The Swiss accounts have been fully transferred, Miss Bowen," Smith said, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. He slid a thick portfolio across the desk. $6.2 million, legally cleared of all international holds. Beatrice Montgomery's deed of gift was remarkably ironclad. She established a blind trust designed specifically to bypass the probate court in the event a non-family member discovered the vault. Because her daughter Amelia was legally declared deceased 2 years ago, and you presented the notarized deed, the assets are yours. Clara traced the edge of the leather portfolio. "And Victor Collins?" Smith smirked, a predatory glint in his eye. "Mr. Collins is currently facing a mountain of legal trouble. We filed charges for trespassing, destruction of property, and attempted assault. Furthermore, the IRS took a keen interest in his business practices once we anonymously tipped them off about his aggressive demolition schedules to cover up undocumented foundational issues. He is filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy." Clara leaned back in her chair. The cold streets of Everett felt like a lifetime ago. The gnawing hunger, the freezing nights on the dusty rug, it was all gone. "What will you do now, Clara?" Smith asked, closing his pen. Clara looked out the window. She thought of the library where she had spent her days keeping warm, and the books that had kept her sane. "I bought a house in upstate New York," Clara said softly, a genuine smile touching her lips. "It has a big fireplace. And I think I'm going to apply to college, study architecture." She paused. "I have a sudden appreciation for how old houses are built." She stood up, shaking Smith's hand. As she walked out of the high-rise building and into the warm spring sunshine, Clara Bowen took a deep breath. She had entered the Montgomery estate with nothing but a trash bag and $32. She was leaving with an empire. If you found yourself holding your breath while Clara navigated the deadly secrets of the Montgomery estate, then you know there's nothing quite like a story of survival, mystery, and sweet, ultimate justice. Clara's journey from the freezing streets to outsmarting a corrupt family for a multi-million-dollar fortune proves that the greatest treasures are often hidden where people are too afraid to look. What would you have done if you found a secret safe hidden behind a wall? Would you have run, or would you have stayed to solve the riddle? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this thrilling real-life escape, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends who love a great mystery. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible, dramatic stories of everyday people beating impossible odds. See you in the next video.